Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
So let me give you a backstory of this presentation just very quickly. The idea of this presentation, the idea of this research started in February 2019 at the last Grand Canyon Historical Society Symposium. And we had 60 inches of snow. We had an indoor presentation that Kern Nuttall, who's the author of In a Better Place, the story of the Grand Canyon Cemetery, he moderated a session. And of course, whenever you talk about the Grand Canyon Cemetery, the big object in the front of it is the United Airlines Memorial. So we had an indoor session where the question was, which we're going to cover in this talk, of course, why the number of victims for United Airlines? Why weren't all identified? Why was there such a disparity between United and TWA, et cetera? So that really got us going. And then I met with Kern in Page that summer, and like most historical research, went down some rabbit holes of trying to get to the medical examiner in Flagstaff and asking them what they had. All of their archives were in dirty, dusty boxes. They weren't going to go back to the late 50s to find archives of how they did the autopsies. But as it turns out, that wasn't the right way to approach the problem. Turns out the right way to approach the problem was to look at the teams put together to do this victim identification. So I'm going to start the presentation with a collage of photos, basically set the tone for the presentation. And this was in the splash sheet, this was in the sheet announcing the presentation. So first you have a set of fingerprints that were defense contractors' fingerprints, and it turns out these are the Sulpizio fingerprints, because I happen to have this card. The next is an iconic Life magazine photo. By the way, Life magazine, July 16, 1956, is one of the most recited and published magazine articles about the entire accident. And there's so many iconic photos in that magazine. And this is the so-called lone casket. Now, it turns out, and I saw at least one or two, I think I saw one lesbian on the call. It turns out that, and I apologize, I'm using her maiden name or her family name, that the lesbians believe, and the family believes, let's put it that way, that this casket was of their deceased father. So very difficult because the photo doesn't have any historical context since it was in Life magazine, but that's what their belief is based upon the appearance of the casket and so forth. And this was the photo in Life magazine a little bit later than the 16th of July. I think it was the 30th of July issue. This one was of the commemoration at the Citizen Cemetery in Flagstaff of the TWA mass funeral. And then this is the monument, and of course that was the day of the commemoration. And then this is the photo taken on August 2nd of the United Airlines monument. At the Pioneer Cemetery in the Grand Canyon National Park South Rim, it's a very very it's a very forward monument. You can't miss it when you go to that cemetery. It's right up close to the entrance. So in terms of the outline, these are the topics I'm going to cover, and this is still research in progress. Like most historical research, you don't really get every piece of information. You put together threads or strands of information, you get evidence, and everything in this presentation is based on photographic or documentary evidence. So first, I want to cover the basics of the Midair collision and show some archival photos of the crash sites, the two crash sites, some drawings of the Midair collision, which is in the background of this outline. And then the next thing is and it's really important to understand, there was one Midair collision, but there were two separate crashes. They weren't identical. They were equally horrendous, but the two crashes were very different. So then after that, we go into search and recovery photos in the newsreel. Flagstaff and the Grand Canyon were the center of the aviation safety universe for about a month to 6 weeks in the middle of the summer of '56. Then we come into the FBI, and this will be an interesting story, how I discovered that the FBI took the lead in victim identification. And they actually developed the forensics for a victim identification, not just for airplane crashes, but other transportation crashes. And then there's some information that no one has seen before. So everything up to here is well documented. I dare say that this could be developed by most folks on this call, most historians on the call. The next point, the fourth point, is more specific to FBI investigations that came through the result of a lot of digging and interviews, and we're still getting information about what the FBI was investigating. So a little bit more of a wordy chart here, but to go into the background for those that aren't familiar with this event. It was a momentous event at the Grand Canyon. It was an event that took place 66 and a half years ago and still echoes to this day. There was a loss of all 128 passengers and crew on two major state-of-the-art aircraft at the time, a DC-7 and a Lockheed 1049 Super Constellation. These were the best aircraft. These were the largest, best aircrafts of the time. They were piston-driven aircrafts, in other words, propeller aircrafts. They weren't jets. They were also two of the major carriers of the time. TWA and United were on top of the heap. There have been many articles, books, and lectures over the past 20 years. This event was not, except for the summer of '56 and a few articles took place after in newspapers. This really didn't get much publicity or much press until about, I would say 15, 20 years ago, with the 50th anniversary, and then subsequently with the National Historic Landmark. NHL stands for National Historic Landmark, not National Hockey League. You'll see the NHL several times in this presentation. That designation in 2014, it's one of the largest in the NHL system, some 2,000 National Historic Landmarks. But that work took place over the period of 2008 to 2013 and uncovered a tremendous amount of archaeological and historical materials. So just for those that don't know it, the crash site is about 10 to 11 miles upstream from the Desert View Watchtower, which is a spectacular part of the Grand Canyon National Park South Rim. The TWA site is in the north slope of a ravine on the northeast corner of Temple Butte. It's relatively accessible. The United site is the upper south side promontory on Char Butte, or Chuar Butte. It's just above the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River. The sandbar that exists in that confluence, which is very prominent, very easy to see, is a great marker for where this accident site is, because it's absolutely directly above that. So again, summarizing what I'm going to cover, this seminar is about the intriguing role of the FBI and the methods used for victim identification, plus some investigation activities not previously disclosed. So that's the hook to keep you going here to the end of the talk. Now we're going to go into a series of drawings and a lot of photos and some animations. So these are two depictions of the midair collision. Remember, we didn't have any video at that time. We didn't have anyone with an iPhone or even a Super 8 camera. And if we did, that photographic equipment wouldn't have survived the crash. So we have to go by the the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB investigation, and then two artists that would put together their best understanding of the midair collision. With all apologies to Mike Nelson if he's on the call. Mike Nelson is the, as you'll see in the next couple of charts, he's one of the experts on this entire event and has written a book about it, has written a very authoritative book about it. He critiqued at least the classic iconic drawing on the left, which is from Life magazine in April of '57, which is when the accident report was summarized in Life magazine. The wings on this is the TWA flight in the front. The United flight is shearing the back of the TWA flight. So TWA didn't even know what was happening. The back of the aircraft was cut, like the last 2 or 3 rows and then the galley in the back. Mike did point out these wings are just not the right angle. It's not a very accurate drawing. It's a depiction. And just accept that this shows roughly how the midair collision occurred. This is a later drawing. This is from a source I found, Bureau of Aircraft Accident Archives. And it's interesting that it shows, it's a little bit harder to see it actually than the Hunter drawing, but it does show perhaps a little more accurate depiction of the angles and so forth. This is an animation in a very chilling British production called Mayday. It's about, I think there's 30 one-hour episodes, and it's played on a few of the cable channels over the years. So this one has no audio. It's a still, it's an animation without audio. What I like about this, and again, apologize to Mike, who's the expert. There are inaccuracies here to be sure. This was produced before Mike Nelson's book was published. So it's based upon older information. But I like the fact it shows, and it's a looper-on, it shows some indication the United flight is coming in at the TWA flight. It shows the United flight turning, cutting the back of the aircraft, shows the TWA aircraft was then basically in a nosedive, then flipped over and hit at the base of Temple Butte or on the slope of Temple Butte as shown in this depiction. That's the TWA crash. Now the next animation is very inaccurate, but again, it shows the distinctly different United crash. The United crash went into Chuar Butte, which isn't shown very accurately by this drawing, by this animation, and the aircraft was in a downward slope, but it does show accurately it was leaning to the left, crashed head on into the bedrock, and that's how that particular aircraft met its demise. Now we're going away from the animation to some stills, and I show you the 3 different stills here, which I think represent the 3 generations of maps. The one on the left is a U.S. Geological Survey map, which is a classic map that is available online, or you can buy a printed version, and it shows the 2 crash sites, at least on a 2D type of map. Then you've got a Google Earth map, which is a 3D map, and this shows again the 2 sites relative to the Google Earth, which is a satellite-based technology that takes photos and compiles them together. And then on the right, we have the Life magazine photo, which is just a regular analog photo of the 2 crash sites taken for the Life magazine article in 1956, showing the United crash site, showing the TWA crash site down below. I wanted to focus a little bit on the United crash site. This is a really good photo taken in October '56 from an expedition. And what I like about this is it shows the promontory on Chuar Butte, shows the sheer cliff. You can see the crash site very clearly with this grayish dark char, and then blowing that up, just taking this oval, blow it up, and you can see the debris. This is, of course, only 3 months after the crash, but you can clearly see the debris in this area. You can see how it went down this ravine or chimney. You can also see that the aircraft crashed just at the top of this particular promontory. And I mean, literally within feet of the top. In fact, some of the wreckage went over on the top of the promontory. I like this very much because this one doesn't show detail, but shows the elevations and shows that 1,000-foot sheer drop from the point of the United crash down to where then it slopes, the talus slope, the so-called talus slope down to the river. Here's that sandbar between the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River. Then we go to, these are National Park Service photos. The NPS took a lot of photos, of course. This was on the Grand Canyon Park, National Park, so they took many of the photos. And a lot of those are available, of course, at the Grand Canyon Special Museum Special Collection, but they're also in Ian Huff, who did the National Historic Landmark application and nomination. He has most of these photos in his presentations. So this again shows the promontory as a photographic image, shows it from reverse view from the top of the promontory, looking back at the Little Colorado River and the sandbar. And then as we zoom in on the actual site of the crash, again, we see not the details you want to, but then when you zoom in on it, you see the molten aluminum, the metal, the wreckage. It's really an inaccessible site. I have not been there. Very few people have been there. Maybe a couple people on this call have been able to go there, but it's very, very inaccessible for most hikers. This is an updated view of the crash site, and with compliments to Kern, Dr. Kern Nuttall, who's on the call, who's on this conference tonight. These are his photos, and they show from Cape Solitude, which is at 6,150 feet, looking down at the 4,000-foot elevation of the United crash site. So again, we just take from back, we zoom in a little bit, and then another view of it from with the sandbar visible. Cape Solitude is an interesting point that can be hiked to. It's a little bit challenging, but it is possible to hike to that point. You have to go over Diné or Navajo Nation territory, but you can get to it. The TWA impact site, not to minimize that site, but that site had much wreckage, and but it's a little bit more accessible. So these photos come again from the National Park Service. They also come from Lost Flight Archives, a site that Mike McComb maintains. He's a FAA person who's an archaeologist in looking at airplane crashes. This is the burn forward fuselage section of the TWA super constellation. So, victim identification, mystery, and challenge. Now we see what the two crash sites look like the day or the time of the crash, the month of the crash. Let me again reference some very valuable materials. We Are Going In, the story of the 1956 Grand Canyon Midair Collision by Mike Nelson. Second edition was published in 2017. It's available at the GCC bookstore. It's also available online. You can email, use this email address. And this book mentions the participation of the FBI twice in the book, but does not elaborate about it. It's an incredible reference book. I use it all the time. The work that Ian Huff and others did for the National Historic Landmark nomination documents do a great job to discuss victim recovery. The photos you see come from that. They do a great job to discuss site cleanup efforts after 56, because there have been like 4 or 5 major site cleanup efforts after the summer of 56. And that's very well documented in considerable detail. The nomination documents do not go into the victim identification. So the question is, going back to that symposium conference in February of 2019. Why the disparity in the number of victims identified from the United flight compared to the TWA flight? Why is there such a huge disparity? 29 victims, 50% of the people on board on the United flight were identified. For TWA flight, 10%, I'm sorry, 10 of the 70 passengers, or 10 of the 70 on board, 14% were identified. That's a huge difference. But I think you're getting an idea why. These were two completely different crashes. Just again, to complete the picture here, the unidentified victims and a few of the identified victims, but mostly unidentified victims, are commemorated at two mass grave sites. The Pioneer Cemetery, which is for United Airlines, and note the spelling of United Airlines in the fifth. A lot of people will say that's not spelled right. It's United has gone through naming schizophrenia. They've had airlines separate, two separate words, and now they have them combined. So just to let you know, that's the way it was spelled in the 50s. They put all the remains they could find, unidentified, in 4 caskets. At the Citizen Cemetery in Flagstaff, they had 66 caskets. So they had a few of the identified victims commemorated there as well. But they only identified 10 TWA. The group that Tom mentioned in the introduction, Tom Martin, patrons of the 1956 Grand Canyon Midair Collision and the Grand Canyon Historical Society, hold commemorative events each June 30th at these two cemeteries. We have for the past 2 years, and we will do so again this June 30th. So again, why the difference? So according to the FBI publications and other accounts, the TWA constellation nosedived, as you saw in that animation, landed upside down and exploded on impact on the slope of Temple Butte. That explosive decompression, first there was explosive decompression because the aircraft was pressurized when United severed its fuselage. Only 40 bodies or parts of bodies removed from the TWA crash site. They only recovered 10 bodies or parts of bodies, of which they identified 10, and only 3 by the FBI. The FBI said they just didn't have that much to work with. They just had really, to put it bluntly, the TWA site was concentrated. It was an inferno. It was all concentrated in one relatively flat location, and that's why the victims were completely mutilated and burned by this collision. The United DC-7 impacted Chouar Butte rock face and flipped. It also flipped over, but it flipped over, and the debris and most of the bodies went into a crevice or chimney 300 feet in depth. So it exploded and burned, but you had this vertical component, and the recovery teams, that's a separate topic. I'm not going to go into the recovery teams because that's a separate webinar in its own right. They recovered 43 bodies, almost, I think, well, what I've seen is not think. All the 43 bodies were recovered from the chimney crevices, the crevice. That's why there was such a larger number of identified victims from the United crash. There were actually 3 unburned and unmutilated bodies. United Captain Robert Shirley, United States or U.S. Marine Corps Captain James Tobias, and 1 other. So the only way you can have 2 or 3 unburned or unmutilated bodies is because of the nature of the crash, dumping its contents into that crevice that you saw. So the FBI identified 29 of the 43 bodies, and the count is they identified 10 by fingerprint analysis, 7 on the basis of jewelry, and 11 by other means. So 11 by other means not burned. They use facial or physical ideas. So for children and infants, of which there were several on this flight, they could use physical ID. And they use dental records. Dental records are the second best form of forensics were the second best form of forensics at that time. So this information is, well, I'm going to now go into a little bit about the recovery operations from those sites, a collage of photos showing the body bag, the collection of body bags and the transport to the temporary morgue, which was at the Coconino County Fairgrounds. The Coconino County Fairgrounds actually was Fort Tuthill until 1955. Fort Tuthill was a Arizona National Guard site that was converted into the county fairgrounds, but there still is what the barracks called the quad is where they set up the morgue because it was near the airport, the Flagstaff airport. They could fly from the airport in Grand Canyon, which at that time was Red Butte. They could fly from the Grand Canyon airport to the Flagstaff airport pretty quickly. There were no photos that I could find inside that morgue or any photos that would be disturbing, and I probably would not want to show them, but they are very careful. They're very careful in those days to respect the process and respect the victims. So you do see body bags. Every body bag had something like a pint of formaldehyde or embalming fluid poured into it. That's something that I've read and picked up in my research repeatedly. And again, all these are classic historic photos. This one is this is a National Park Service photo published in Life. So the black and white photos tend to be in Life. This is a National Park Service photo that I got from Ian Huff in his publication. So Red Butte was the airfield. You know, there is an airport at the Grand Canyon today. It's a newer airport. The Red Butte airfield was on the other side of Tucson, and it's now a historic site. There's nothing there, but that's what they used. So some more color photography showing at the United site, the recovery operations with the body bags, and the body bags would include all body parts that they could find, and they would try to segregate them so they didn't have a mixing of remains. And then the TWA recovery camp, black and white photo, which is from, actually this one is from the National Park Service. And then this is the Coconino County Fairgrounds as it appears today. And the Fort Tuthill quad, these are the barracks on each side. They call it the quad because they have four barracks in a quad formation. So now we're going to do a newsreel, and I'm going to try to play this best I can and see if we get audio. If not, we'll just go ahead and let you see the got to get to the right point. 2320. There we go. 2320. You can.
Were brought up by helicopter. Here, Army, CAB, and airline officials talk
You-
over future
You can
operations.
look at this anytime. There's the YouTube link.
Burial service, 3 faiths, is planned at Flagstaff, Arizona, for the unidentified victims of the 2 planes.
This crash in the Grand Canyon.
So what I did was also took screenshots of the newsreel. As far as I know, that's the only newsreel that exists of this event. There might be private videos of video. It would be classic photography, cinematic photography. Actually, there wasn't Super 8 at that time, but there was 8mm photography at that time. They may exist, but I don't have access to them. But this is the only publicly available newsreel that I could find. And then in this Mayday, they show it's a dramatization. It's not the actual. You can see by the quality of the photos, this isn't actually what they recovered, but it would be typical of what they recovered from the site in terms of leather briefcases, some other objects, personal effects. The leather briefcase is important because I'm going to come back to leather briefcase a little bit later in this presentation. Leather is not that easily burned. And because leather is not that easily burned, they were able to recover or look for briefcases which may have important materials in them. So this brings us to how I learned about, or how I uncovered what the FBI involvement was in this identification process. So I picked up this. This is the only newspaper article I could find that lists their involvement. So I'm going to read it because it's not maybe that clear. The FBI was reported to be sending its assistant director of identification, Quinn Tamm, misspelled, they spelled it Tan, but it's Tamm, to Flagstaff to identify victims when the bodies are removed from the canyon. Tamm, a fingerprint expert, worked on the Graham murder plane crash in Colorado. An FBI spokesman said Tamm was coming to Arizona purely for identification purposes, not for investigation. When you see statements like that, it's almost like you have to believe just the opposite. The fact that they said that means that they were coming to do some investigations. And the reason why the Graham murder plane crash in Colorado was the first of many times where an airplane or an aircraft was used for nefarious purposes. And this case, just to put a button on it, Mr. Graham planted a bomb on board the aircraft to collect the insurance money from, of all things, his mother. It was a very gruesome case, but it took place just a few months before. It took place in late 1955. The FBI was getting a fantastic reputation of being able to solve these cases, do the forensics. In the case of the Graham nefarious murder case, they had to solve the crime. I mean, that was a horrendous crime. So the FBI was getting that well-founded reputation as being problem solvers for airplane crashes. So a little bit about fingerprints, because really when we come to the forensic techniques in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, it's all about fingerprints. So this is a collage of fingerprint materials. If one were to do a fingerprint today, and it's a voluntary, for non-criminals, voluntary to submit a fingerprint card for identification, there are electronic ways to do fingerprints. They could be scanned in with a machine these days. You don't have to do a ink fingerprint, but this is, you can actually get this card and submit this to the FBI. This is available online. Of course, you saw this before. This is the Sulpizio Defense Contractor ID card and fingerprint for security clearance. So in those days, there were all military, all defense contractors had to submit fingerprints. Fingerprinting is actually a very specialized science, and they would use algorithms to relate the nature of a fingerprint so they could reduce the number of fingerprints they had to look through when they're doing a victim when they're doing any identification. When you think about it, you have 70 million people in the United States. 35% of the US at that time had been fingerprinted, or they were on file. And then you go to a crime scene, or you go to any sort of a scene, an airplane crash or railroad crash, and you get a fingerprint. If you're trying to match that fingerprint against a pool of 70 million, and it's all manual, there was no computers. None of this was computerized till the 80s and, well, 1980. You had to render the fingerprints into an algorithm or a mathematical formula so that you at least could narrow the search down from 50, 60 million down to a few thousand. Really tough in those days. So what I did was I found a series of archival photos about the FBI's fingerprint facilities in the 40s and 50s. This is their file room, and it was so huge that they put it in the DC Armory building. This is where you store 70 or 80, or let's say 70 million fingerprints. What's interesting, and by the way, they started this in 1924, and it was established by an act of Congress to set up a division within the FBI. It was part of their charter. Interestingly, fingerprints are not considered static. They actually only have a validity of 15 months. And that also played maybe into one of the activities that took place where the FBI investigated my dad and Mr. Lasby's offices, which we'll come to. But this is the file room. Another view of the file room. Look at all these people filing. they were actually taking the fingerprints and rendering the number of loops and deltas and swirls, and so that they could render these fingerprints into some very simple mathematical algorithm. Again, this is what it was when it was manual. By the way, all criminal fingerprints are kept cumulatively since they started this program in the 1920s. So they have a file, at least in this photo, notorious dead criminals. Since 1999, the FBI has used a database which is completely digital. It's called Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. Now a fingerprint identification through 70 million fingerprints could take maybe about 5 or 10 minutes with their digital computers that they have. It's not instantaneous. It could take a few minutes. So that's how complex they are. And I'm sure you've seen maybe in some movies how they have different points. They'll maybe they'll render them digitally with maybe 60, 70, 100 points. This is what an examiner would do. So an examiner would have this fingerprint card, and what they would do is they took these cards to Flagstaff after the crash recovery and victim identification. They took several thousand cards to Flagstaff. And I'm going to now move to an article which really is the seminal article in this area. This is a remarkable archive. First of all, Quinn Tamm is the quintessential FBI G-man who advanced victim identification through forensic tools in the 1940s and 1950s. He had a very long career with the FBI. He was assistant director, reporting to Clyde Tolson, who was the #1 in command under J. Edgar Hoover. This guy was in the leadership. But this article is actually was a quick hit. The minute you put Quinn Tamm into a search driver, this article comes up as the top hit. And it's fantastic because you have, in his words, a report on what they did at the Grand Canyon. So the article is entitled Handling Disaster Problems and Law Enforcement Tasks. So he didn't just cover the Grand Canyon event, but he covered about half a dozen investigations that he managed and put an article together which goes through the different techniques that they used. So they got the FBI moved into accident identification following a plane crash outside of DC in 1940, where there were 2 FBI employees. So that's where they stepped in, and they took on this rather unique role. They also had a very close partnership with United Airlines because of the 2 United crashes in October and November, the aforementioned criminal sabotage case. The paper goes through all the methodical processes that need to be established in running a forensic victim identification. And one of the pretty simple, pretty logical, obtain an accurate passenger list. Okay, we wouldn't think of anything about that today, but in those days it was all pencil, paper, ink, and paper. There's nothing computerized. Have a central command and control center, set up, establish a morgue, and tag all remains and bodies, scrupulously tag them. In this article, he writes about recovery teams need to recover victim remains and bodies. Care must be taken to avoid commingling objects lying around the body, and that would include rings, wallets, and dental plates. So these are critical items that are then used for victim identification. So for a typical event, and this one being maybe a bigger event because of 128 victims, they would bring out 3,000 or 4,000 sets of fingerprints. So the FBI left Washington with these fingerprint files on July 2nd and came out to northern Arizona. After fingerprints, dental charts or dental x-rays are the next best form of identification. The problem with this is one needs to have a trained dental technician to bring the physical x-rays to the crash scene to make the identification. And you had victims from all over the country. So this actually went beyond the time frame they wanted for the inquest and the autopsy. So not too many victims were identifications were established with dental X-rays just because of the time involved in those days. They couldn't fax the X-rays. They could maybe they'd have to fly them out to northern Arizona and have someone who's a dental technician take those X-rays and then match them against the victim dental impressions. Personal effects of jewelry. So this is one with kudos to Mike Nelson. His uncle Jack Rusham, who was also on the United flight, was identified by an engraved wedding ring. That's a very valuable. So anything that does not get destroyed by the heat or by the fire is a very useful form of identification. I want to give proper homage to the United Crash Site recovery team, which really consisted of both Rocky Mountain club climbers and Swiss mountain climbers. I mean, they had to go into that. They had to go down to into that 300-foot deep chimney or crevice and recover all these objects, all these body parts. It was a gruesome task. The TWA crash site was one in which the FBI had the least to work with. And the United crash site, as mentioned before, had the problem that it was inaccessible. So again, to summarize, in the case of the United site, most of the aircraft and its fuel fell into the deep crevice. The FBI took fingerprint impressions from 12 victims and identified 10 of the 12. They had a fantastic rate of identification. They identified 7 based on jewelry. They used facial, physical ID, and dental records to identify another 11. One dental record that did not result in identification is fellow United passenger Leon David Cook. His son told me that they presented the dental records to United Airlines, but there was no positive ID. So in all, 29 from 43 bodies recovered at the United site were identified. That's a really exceptional rate of identification and answers the question, which we thought we could get from the coroner in Coconino County, why or how did they identify those 29 versus the 29 that were not identified, therefore interred at the Grand Canyon Cemetery. Again, this will be on recording so you can see these are some of the references. I'm very big on giving proper reference, footnoting references. The Quinn Tamm reference is extraordinary. There are 3,000 or 4,000 pages from the FBI files that have been declassified and are online. There's also an official FBI site for archives and released or declassified information, plus an Freedom of Information Act library. And this is the website for that official government location. Here's some materials from the Quinn Tamm files. Here's a letter of appreciation from J. Edgar Hoover to Quinn Tamm about the work he did. He said, I feel a really splendid job was done by you and others Bureau personnel at some of the Grand Canyon, at the scene of the Grand Canyon crashes. And then here's a letter from George Cadera, the medical director of United Airlines, thanking J. Edgar Hoover for the work of the FBI. These are all on this site, these FBI archive sites. And here's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover to George Cadera, thanking him again for the letter that he got. So this is the identification team in Flagstaff. These were the agents and the experts that worked on it. There were at least 4 plus Quinn Tamm that I identified from these materials. Now here's one of the discoveries that leads to the next phase of investigation in this program. There is an internal FBI memo about the Grand Canyon crash investigation. It's missing. It would be Tamm's report to his boss, maybe a 4 or 5 page memo, because that's referenced in the letter from J. Edgar Hoover to Tamm, based on memo, Tamm to Tolson, 7/9/56. So we don't have that. That's not been released. that's being either inadvertently not been released or it's being held for confidential purposes. And if it's being held for confidential purposes 67 years later, there must be one heck of a confidential piece of information in there that they don't want to release. So just to show you, there was a report on the United Airlines crash site near Laramie, Wyoming in October of '55. This is the report. I don't give you the entire report, I'm just showing part of it, and shows you they even had the victims list. We really want to see that report that the FBI, that Tamm did for the Grand Canyon crash. That's a critical piece of information. So I intend to file a Freedom of Information Act request for that letter, or for that memo. Okay, that's what we turned up from the FBI files. And by the way, going back, I had to go through all 3,000 or 4,000 pages because they're not properly, they're not very well organized. And the search driver is not very good. This took a lot of time, but that's historical research. So now a little bit about to whet your appetite, to tease you, what else could be going on with the FBI and some United passengers? And this comes from family and family interviews with Kathy Lasby Natali, who's the daughter of Larry Lasby. She was a young girl at the time, and the niece of Thomas J. Sulpizio, Marie Lindsay, who's my first cousin. A little bit of background: these gentlemen were working for Green Government Products Division in Philadelphia. It's a manufacturing plant shown in the background. They were a U.S. Air Force contractor to produce jet fighter gunnery trainers installed at Nellis Air Force Base. Nellis has a weapons school. Mr. Lasby made trips to Nevada in the year before. This is declassified. There's nothing classified about it. Lasby and Sulpizio worked on this program, and the work was absolutely in the public domain, according to a July 2nd newspaper interview with Ream's chief engineer. These two passengers were working on something else, more confidential and classified, for the Ream and the U.S. Air Force. And why is that the case? Well, first of all, let me jump to the article. This is the article from the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and it's a defunct paper, so this was hard to. I actually got this from him at the GC Museum Special Collection Archives, but also the Lasby's had the article. So this confirms by the chief engineer, Mr. McQuaid, they were on the West Coast on classified government business. No further details except they were touring aircraft plants in Boeing in Seattle and Hughes in Los Angeles. This is their itinerary as written, handwritten by Ray Lasby, left with his family. This is a very, very unique archive, very valuable. I'm sure other passengers had itineraries, but to find this particular archive, I must compliment the Lasbys on sharing it and making it. But to see in his handwriting, United 718 on Saturday, June 30th, with the flight times indicated, it's chilling and shows the hotels that they stayed at. But going back to what else is going on. So what else is going on is there were searches of their offices at the manufacturing plant in Philadelphia by the FBI or another government agency. Perhaps the U.S. Air Force sent their security officers there. So Mr. Sulpizio's cousin, Marie Lindsay, recalls seeing an unpublished photo with crime scene tape blocking their offices. And certainly they could have been getting, the FBI could have been there to get more fresh fingerprint impressions. One would wonder why they've got these defense contractor fingerprint evidence. They already had them. But there's more. The Ream manufacturing plant GM searched the Lasby's home office for documents and papers shortly after the crash. And according to a written essay in 2014 by Stan Lasby, who's son of Ray Lasby, he was 9 at the time. He unfortunately is deceased, but he said that Ream and the U.S. Air Force requested the United Recovery Teams, those mountaineers, to search for Mr. Lasby's briefcase in the crash debris, a leather briefcase. Everyone in those days. All businessmen had leather briefcases. So what else is going on? What were these two engineers doing? Well, we know from letters that they supplied to both the Lasbys and to my family. They were on the West Coast. They left on June 24th. They met up with at least one Wright Air Development Center engineer in Seattle and Culver City, and at least one, maybe more, but at least one. Rheem had a very close relationship with the U.S. Air Force and functioned as the manufacturer for their systems, their hardware. Obviously, the Air Force personnel returned to Dayton, Ohio by a different itinerary. They weren't on the flight, obviously. This was the declassified. I want to throw this in because I love showing 1950s technology. You could almost see this in a Buck Rogers movie. This is all declassified. This is a brochure. I mean, even the logo is so 50s. The hardware, everything about it just screams pre-digital computer era. But I thought I would show you that because this is not what this is already work they completed. Now, a little something more what's going on, part two. I had an email exchange with Kathy Lasby-Natali in late November last year as we're working on this program. They've been so wonderful working and opening up their archives and having very open exchanges. They also did a fantastic oral interview with Tom Martin in 2014. She has an acquaintance, one of the FBI agents on the victim's identification case he's deceased, but her husband, his wife is still thankfully with us, and reached out to Kathy. And in fact, last June when she found out we were doing this anniversary, the 65th commemoration, she said that he was taking the experience was overwhelming to him. He was working out of the FBI Denver office, assigned the crash case. He left shortly thereafter because it was too gruesome, too upsetting. It was an awful job, and it really bothered him. And this is the most intriguing thing I believe that she told Kathy Natali. The FBI agent revealed he was assigned to search for 6 specific people from the United flight to look for fingerprints or remains of 6 specific people. Kathy didn't give me the name of the FBI agent, nor did his widow wife recall which 6 people were of interest to the FBI. We can't assume that it would be Lasby and Sulpizio, but there were 15 defense contractor and military people on this flight. It could be among those 6. These are threads of information that suggest there's something else going on here. The only other thing that could come to mind, aside from the Hughes aircraft Culver City visit, the Boeing visit in Seattle, Hughes was producing multiple devices for the U.S. Air Force. And Rheem had its aircraft and missile division based in Downey, which is in Los Angeles, which was eventually sold to Aerojet General a couple of years later. Aerojet General is the leader in ballistic missile rocket components, which are Minuteman ICBM components. Rheem's work may have involved nuclear weapon ballistic missile development because Mr. Lasby attended the Operation Teapot test the year before at the Nevada test site in Yucca Flat. There are no further details about this program. It still might be classified. I'm trying to find out as much as I can. But with the sale of the company, with these threads of suggesting they were doing something new with the Air Force, and that's perfectly reasonable since they were a hot defense contractor at the time, suggests that it wasn't just those Buck Rogers spherical devices you saw, but they might have been working on nuclear ballistics. And Mr. Lasby, the Lasby shared these family archival. Actually, these were taken by Mr. Lasby. He's in the middle with 2 nuclear scientists, and this was the Operation Teapot moth test of a low yield fission device in late February '55. things took place a lot more slowly in those days. And there could have been a relationship between, you just don't go casually to attend a nuclear test at a site, even though there may be 10,000 engineers and technicians at this test. You just wouldn't go to that site as a visitor. So there might be a connection. Certainly for this defense contractor, they may have had some activities with the Air Force, and they may have had papers in their briefcases in their offices that the Air Force wanted back. So follow-up historical work, we're coming up at the hour, so it's a good time to stop. But the follow-up work will be the file of Freedom of Information request to get that July 9th memo from the FBI Tamm to his boss. Locate the photo of the FBI or other government agency searching the offices of Ream, and I'm actually working on that. Continue to research the classified activities of Ream Government Products Division and of Mr. Lasby and nuclear weapons, potentially nuclear weapons and missiles, and track down the identity of the 6 victims who were on the FBI list of interested persons of interest in a good way, persons of interest that they wanted to identify, and perhaps want to identify to see if there were any papers in their briefcases or on their persons. So I will just have a final chart here. Of course, we're running really tight on time, so Q&As might be limited, but certainly contact the Grand Canyon Historical Society or me through the outing email. This is the same email address Tom showed earlier in the presentation. And then there's my personal email address. And look, if for those of you on this call, I hope to see many of you at the Grand Canyon Historical Society History Symposium, November 2nd, 3rd, and 4th at the Grand Canyon South Rim. That's a fantastic event. If you're interested in history, if you're interested in the Grand Canyon, it's a must event. So I want to thank you all, whoever stayed for the call. And if I can answer a couple questions really quickly, I'll go to it. So Tom Martin, do I stop sharing?
You do. Thank you so very, very much, Tom
There we
Sulpizio.
go. There we go.
It's really great. So I've got a couple questions I'll lead off, and then we have a couple questions in chat.
Okay.
Neil Newby and his partner were river runners in August of 1956, and they walked up to the TWA site. They were interviewed by the FBI later in the year, and the FBI had told them they were looking for over $1 million in negotiable securities.
Yes.
Have you run across that at all yet?
No, only
in your
you
research
mentioned
outside of that interview?
only you've been the only one to tell me about that, and I did not follow that line of investigation.
Okay, so that may show up in your FOIA that you'll do.
Could be.
Next question is, how did you discover that the FBI was involved with this? Was that through Mike Nelson's book?
Mike Nelson's book mentioned it twice in passing, and what really and thank I mean, his book is so thorough that he even picked that up. But what really was the spark was that Pittsburgh Post-Gazette article on July 2nd, because it gave you the name of Quinn Tamm. Without the name of Quinn Tamm, I wouldn't know where to start.
Okay.
And
I really look forward to the information you get out of that FOIA. Last question I've got, and it's so hard to say in these the films you showed of how the two planes might have hit each other. Do you think United could have just put it into immediate dive to miss? They would have had a couple options: try to turn off to the right, or turn off to the left, or just nose down, nose up. Do you have any thoughts about that? Was there any corrective action which could have been taken other than what they did?
you can look at the Mayday. It's about 40 minutes because we don't have advertisements since the YouTube. You can look at the Mayday. You can see what the actors in the cockpit did. I mean, the 3 of them, and I'm happy to see the Hashes are on the call. Their nephew was the engineer on that flight, and I mean they had a minute. They may have had a minute to take corrective action from the time of the Midair Collision to when they had to when they hit the rock face. So you can see what Shirley tried. I mean, that is not an accurate depiction, and it is a dramatization, but it's still chilling. So to answer your question, I wouldn't say that I'm qualified as I'm not a pilot or a navigator to be able to comment, but certainly those who are pilots and navigators could probably help us a little bit in that regard. You know, Sullenberger is actually an ambassador to an international aviation safety. It's like an ambassadorship, and he's been on TV recently because of all the near misses that have taken place this year. People like that, people who are safety experts and who are on Mayday and other aviation accident shows, would be people to consult with about what you just asked.
Okay.
But I didn't look at it any further than just looking at the video.
Yeah,
By the
no
way,
worries.
when I played that newsreel, did the sound come through or did?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Oh, good. So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
got picked up by my microphone.
Zoom's doing better. Okay, there's a couple of questions I'd like to
Sure.
go through from the chat. Dennis Cruz wants to know if the United plane had a head-on crash into Chuar Butte, how come the pilot was able to be thrown out into the chimney and therefore was identifiable? Wouldn't he have been burned and not be identified?
Well, that's a very good question. And there's two theories about this. Mike is on the call, and Mike could certainly write he can actually write as an email to the to the Grand Canyon Historical Society, to the outings email address, because his theory is that Captain Shirley may have, before the Midair collision, had actually left the cockpit, perhaps to use the lavatory, perhaps to go and say hello to the passengers. So he might not have been in the cockpit. Remember, both Gerard Fiore and Harms, who were in the cockpit, are unrecognized, were not identified. Those two were not identified. They're at the monument. Shirley was identified, and he was not only identified, he wasn't even mutilated or burned. So that is a mystery as to how he would have been thrown. I don't know exactly where they found him, whether they found him in the chimney. According to what these reports the FBI gave, all the bodies were recovered from the chimney. That he was not thrown above, wasn't thrown on top of the promontory, because that would have been another way to escape, the inferno.
Right.
But that's one I have not been able to nail down exactly where they found Shirley.
Right, and that would
Michael,
answer that question, was where they found him, and it sounds like he was not necessarily found in the chimney.
and I'll get with Mike, and we'll pull our information together and see if because Mike did he did a lot of oral interviews for his book, and he may have spoken to some
Okay.
individuals who may have known where Shirley's body was found.
So thank you. So Erica Pond has a comment. She said her aunt was on the TWA plane.
Correct. I know.
And her remains were not identified. Two summers ago, she hiked to the Trans World Airlines crash site while on a rafting trip and was amazed at how much debris, including personal effects, were still there and recognizable.
Yep.
It was truly incredible to see.
It's true. In fact, Tom, you've shared with me photos from an expedition in the mid to late 60s, and the luggage tags of the navigator were still there, and they were in good condition.
Right.
Anything that was leather did not burn. So anything leather is going to be charred but not burned.
Right. Gordon Reader notes, as far as intrigue with passengers in the defense industry, having lived in Southern California at the time, many people that flew out of LAX fit in that category. As an aside, in 1986, there was another midair collision over the Grand Canyon. They were sightseeing, flying well below the rim. 25 people were killed.
I know that one.
Right. After that, flying below the rim was outlawed.
That's right.
Haley Haley Johnson, the president of the Grand Canyon Historical Society, would like you to know that this is a wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for all your hard work and dedication to this subject.
Well,
absolutely
you,
intriguing.
Haley, we'll look forward to, of course, I'll look forward to seeing you on June 30th at our commemoration at both the Pioneer Cemetery next to the Shrine of Ages, and then as others at the Citizen Cemetery near Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. Well, thank you for that compliment. The beauty of these outings, this is not a finished. These are intended to be outings. They're intended to present work in progress. This is a work that, well, when Tom Martin found about that I was working on this last November and early December, he didn't have to twist my arm, but he really wanted to. He was going to twist my arm if I said no, but he didn't have to twist my arm, but I said yes, and has been a tremendous mentor in working through this process of putting together this paper tonight. And I'm very grateful to him and his oral interviews that are just his oral and others that are doing the oral interview program. It's just an incredible service to historians.
You're very kind, Tom. Maybe with that, this is a good place to go ahead and wrap up this evening's presentation.
Yep. Thank you,
I'd
Tom
like
Carpenter.
to-
I think Tom Carpenter just did a group comment, and of course Tom is formerly with TWA, predecessor to TWA, I guess, became American or something. It's been so many acquisitions over the years, but Tom presented the floral arrangement of the TWA cemetery, the TWA gravesite last June, and was one of 25 that did come out for the commemoration last year. So thanks, Tom.
Nice. And Tom Carpenter says, great presentation, thoroughly enjoyed and appreciate your efforts to bring this to us via Zoom. Looking forward to additional presentations, and I am too. Lovely.
Well, let's see how fast we can get that Freedom of Information Act satisfied or fulfilled. It may never be fulfilled. It may be a redacted document where anything pertaining to nuclear weaponry is blacked out. But that will tell us, that alone will tell us things. Even if we don't see the words, we'll know there's something confidential they don't want to reveal.
We shall see. Great. With
Thank
that,
you all. I tried to stay within the hour and 15-minute time
No,
frame,
you did good.
and I think
You did
we're
good.
okay.
Just want to mention a month from today will be the next virtual outing with Dennis Foster on some of his continuing research on Grand Canyon trails, and we hope to see you then. Thank you again, Tom Sulpizio, and everyone who
pleasure.
attended tonight. With that, we will conclude this month's presentation. You all have a good evening.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.